Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. My name's Elaine Leavenworth. I'm the Chief Marketing and External Affairs Officer for Abbott. We're very proud to sponsor today's Women and Development Global Forum. It's a terrific audience here. I'm so glad to see so many people coming to hear the great speakers that I'm going to introduce to you in a minute. This is a really special day because I think this is both professionally and personally a great place to be. We have with us today three women who are going to talk about some world-class issues and challenges and opportunities. The advancement of women and the benefit that this brings is something that touches us all. It remains a vital topic in the workplace, of course, but more and more, it's a vital topic in the marketplace. In fact, recently, Prime Minister Modi said that, Prime Minister of India said that if India had to increase its GDP, we have to increase the participation of women in our economy. That's just one of many examples that I'm sure our speakers could share with you today. In my industry, the healthcare industry, women make about 80% of the healthcare decisions, which makes them a powerful force for their families, but also for the economy and healthcare. Advancing women is smart business, and it also pays a double dividend, as you will learn from the authors of Fast Forward. The double dividend is that women take their earnings and reinvest them back into their communities and their families. It strengthens society, and it drives further economic development, sort of what we call the ultimate virtuous cycle. That's why I love this book and why I'm looking forward to our discussion here today. Fast Forward doesn't just advocate for women. It lays out the many practical ways that women drive the economy and how this is transforming business and communities for the better. But don't take just my word for it. It's better that you hear from our authors themselves. I'm really honored to welcome Melanne Verveer and Kim Azzarelli, founders of Seneca Women and the authors of Fast Forward. Both Melanne and Kim have led storied careers that have largely revolved around creating positive change for women. Their new book, Fast Forward, is the outcome of having detailed conversations with more than 50 women about their lives. I can attest to the detailed part personally. Kim is a very dynamic interviewer. The result is a book that provides inspiring and instructive guidance on combining power with purpose and how that benefits us all. You have our guests' full bios in your program, but let me briefly highlight a few points. Melanne is the executive director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, a founding partner of Seneca Point Global and co-founder of Seneca Women. In 2009, she was appointed as the very first U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Women's Issues, where she helped drive tremendous progress on behalf of women around the world. We were very fortunate at Abbott to work with her on just one project in helping women empower themselves in the country of Myanmar. Joining Melanne as her co-author is Kim Azzarelli. Kim is the chair and co-founder of the prestigious Avon Global Center for Women and Justice at the Cornell Law School, where she also serves as an adjunct professor. Kim is a partner in Seneca Point Global and co-founder of Seneca Women. They will be joined in conversation today by Faye Hartog-Levin. Faye is a distinguished fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and among many other important positions, she served as the 65th Ambassador of the United States to the Netherlands from 2009 to 2011. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our panel to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs.
Thank you, Elaine. And Melanne, it's wonderful to welcome you back to Chicago. I met Melanne when I was serving in The Hague, and I was impressed by her from the very first time. And I feel privileged to have been able to call her, and am calling her a friend, and happy
Absolutely.
that you're back here. Kim, it's wonderful to meet you, and I've been impressed with your work and certainly the book. So I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to talk to both of you about it today. I was very impressed by the book and was delighted to see that so many of the sponsors and supporters and former speakers that the Council's Women on Global Development has had, and so that you have recognized some of the same people that we've recognized, and that's always makes you feel good. I think we'd like to talk today about what brought you two together, what brought you to writing this book. And I also hope you'll share some of the stories that are in the book because there's so many and they're very compelling. The first question I wanted to ask you was, how long did it take you to decide to write the book, and how long did it take you to write the book?
Well, let me begin by saying what a personal pleasure it is for me to be back here. I want to start by correcting the record. This is my 4th time back with the Chicago Council, so obviously I have a very fond feeling for this organization, for what it represents, and for what it has meant for this city and for our country. So thank you for all that you do. I also want to say what a pleasure it is for me to be here with Faye and for Kim to meet her, because as she said, I got to know her when she was the United States Ambassador to Netherlands, and she was just extraordinary. And the fact that we could come together on women's issues across the Atlantic really, I think, said something that we're trying to say in the book, that this is a moment of women's leadership, and there's no telling what we can do together. And I want to thank Elaine and Kathy Pickus both, and all of the Abbott people, because Elaine mentioned a partnership that Abbott had with the State Department on Myanmar, and what they are doing, and we talk some about it in the book, is very cutting-edge work in businesses' recognition of what women represent as a sound business investment, but also for social progress. So I just wanted to say all of that because for me, and Kim now joining me, this is a very special moment. What we wanted to do with the book, I first met Kim when I was working with the Vital Voices Global Partnership, which was an NGO that I co-founded with Madeleine Albright and Hillary Clinton and some others that continued work that had gone on through the 90s to invest in emerging women leaders through the talents of people like those in this room who mentored women globally. And when the administration ended, the question was, overseas, the question was, what's going to happen to us now? And at home, the women in particular, and men too, who were engaged were saying this shouldn't end. And so I started this organization, and what does one do when one's running a nonprofit? Search for dollars. And as part of my search, I went to Avon. And there I met a very dynamic young woman who was the corporate secretary for the company, as well as the assistant general counsel. And it was an immediate mutual understanding of the role of business, not as charity, not a bad thing, or even philanthropy, not a bad thing, but business understanding. It was in business's interest to have a global women's strategy and to invest in women. And they were a company, obviously, that had invested in women for decades and decades. And I remember as we started this conversation, not knowing her, I was with a young colleague from Vital Voices who said, as soon as Kim spoke, she said, oh my God, she's one of us. And after that, as we worked together over the years in varying ways in the different positions that we had, we kept understanding something was happening. And especially this accumulation of data and research that was showing that this is not just the right thing to do. And it is a moral imperative. Nobody can take that away from any of us. That's fundamentally what this is about. Gender equality is a moral imperative. But it is also the smart and strategic thing to do. And what the data was showing is why it's in the interest of governments, in the interest of companies, in the interest of any element of society that wants to make a difference, that they clearly need to invest in this space. And so to answer your question now, we talked about, we've got to put this on paper. And then we'd go on and do other things. And the conversation, again, when are we going to do this? And we finally, we were also fortunate to know the publisher of Houghton Mifflin, who was the first woman in 150 years of that company to run the company. And she kept saying, you've got to write this book. So the pressures came together, and we finally did get serious about it. And it took us a year and a half. I've lost track. They were long days and long hours and long nights.
And did you have a substantial amount of the research done before you actually made the decision?
Yeah, we knew this was the stuff we had been living. And so to access it, it was the brunt of speeches, it was the stuff of work. And so it wasn't an original research project. There is a lot of research in the book, and it was also the result of our mutual experiences.
And when you decided to write the book, did you talk about what you hoped you would accomplish besides getting it published in terms of its effect on the readers?
We're both activists, and we didn't want to write a book to write a book. We wanted to write a book that could activate lots and lots of people at home and around the world to understand that we are at a moment. We are at a moment when we've got more emerging leaders and female leaders in positions of all kinds, positions of authority. We are at a moment when we have this evidence-based case like we've never had. We are at a moment of technological breakthroughs when we can connect instantly. And we really feel if we seize this moment, there's no telling what we can do to fast forward women and girls around the world.
Was there a particular generation that you had in mind, or did you think this was multi-generational?
Multi.
I'm the multi-generational part of the conversation.
We're multi.
Well, first of all, I want to also thank you for hosting us and thank Abbott, our friends at Abbott, and so many people in this room who've been doing so much around the world. Julie is another great example to fast forward women and girls. But we definitely think this is a multi-generational, and it's a multi-gender book. So we wanted to sort of lay out in one place the business case, as Melanne said. Me coming from the private sector, Melanne coming from the public sector, we both saw that there was this opportunity for people to rethink the way they thought about women. And part of it for me started when C.K. Prahalad wrote that book, The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid. And he said you have to think about how you look at the bottom of the pyramid, not as victims, not as the poor who need your help, but as partners in growth and partners in change. And at that time I was at Avon, and I thought, well, who's at the bottom of the pyramid? It's women. So we need to think about women in the same way. And so the idea was, Melanne coming from the public sector, to make the case for women, for why governments, in her role as ambassador, but also in all her other roles, to make the case for why governments really need to think about women as partners to grow their economies. And for me, coming from the private sector, it was the idea that Avon, who was in the business of empowering women, right, had been giving women the right to sell Avon before women had the right to vote in this country, understood the power of women. But other companies were missing the real potential. And so when the research started coming in, which, by the way, much of which Melanne, I think, secretly commissioned. But anyway, as this research was coming in and more companies, including from the World Bank to Goldman Sachs, I always say that if Goldman Sachs has done the math, investing in women makes sense. But even a couple weeks ago, McKinsey put out another great report, the McKinsey Global Institute, that if you invest in women, equal parity, if women have equal parity, they could drive $12 to $28 trillion by 2025, global GDP. So we wanted to lay out the business case so that everybody would have that at their fingertips to make the case from where they sit. But it is a multi-generational question because it's not just about being the CEO. We wanted, of course, CEOs, and we have CEOs and prime ministers. Prime Minister, you mentioned Modi, Prime Minister Abe going to Davos to talk about why he had to put women at the center of his strategy if he wanted to grow his economy. CEOs like Muhtar Kent talking about women as the fastest growing economic force in the world today. But our whole book is the fact that each of us have to understand our power. It's not just about being CEO, although we want, of course, the tone at the top to happen, and we're grateful that it's happening. But we want each person to understand their own power, know where they sit, and then figure out what their purpose is and how they can use their power to basically effectuate change. Because ultimately, we feel that the same 5,000 people talking to each other, while it's very important, and the fact that we even have 5,000 people, leaders talking about women is a huge thing, but ultimately it has to become a very grassroots type of approach, but not grassroots only on the grassroots level. It has to be the middle as well. All the men and women in corporate America, or corporate around the world, all the women who are storming the ranks of governments. Maybe we're not at the top yet, but we're very close.
Well, and just back up for 1 minute.
Yeah, sure.
And I think I remember a quote attributed to you that you became addicted to purpose.
Yes.
And I thought it would be helpful to maybe share at which point in your corporate career you became more interested in philanthropy or, as you say, addicted to purpose.
I mean, it was a very clear moment for me, and it was the moment when a foundation that I had been working with called the Virtue Foundation, who is a volunteer organization. There's a surgeon who's in the book who we interviewed. His name is Dr. Ebi Elahi. He's an ocular plastic surgeon. He had been in Cambodia operating, as he did as a volunteer, and he found an acid violence ward where there was a 6-week-old baby who had been doused with acid while she was breastfeeding with her mother. And basically the sentiment was, throw her out, we'll make another. You know, she can't be fixed, throw her out. And he saw that child and knew that that child would have a major disadvantage being a girl and being blind in Cambodia. And the fact for me that there was no penalty for the perpetrator was something that I couldn't get my mind around. And I had always sort of been involved with women's issues. I grew up in the women's movement. But to see that baby doused with acid, I realized, well, wait a second, surely I'm a Cornell-educated lawyer. I'm the corporate secretary of a public company that focuses on women. Honestly, if I can't do something to affect change, who can? And so when I walked out of that room that day, I realized, well, wait a second. It's great what I'm doing, but if I could use what I have to do more, maybe we could do something. And I was very inspired by the Virtue Foundation's motto, which was one person at a time, one act at a time. So I got myself very excited, and a whole bunch of things transpired, including the Avon Center for Women in Justice. But I think when I started focusing on that child and focusing on the fact that I could do something or that I would die trying, doors started opening for me, including the door which led me to Ambassador Verveer, that you could have never imagined in my career. So one by one, each little win that I had relating to that particular project or relating to women and girls gave me more energy. And the more I got to be around positive people who also shared this obsession, Melanne, I'm going to call you obsessed, with advancing women and girls, the more energy I got, the more I became addicted. And then I was willing to make sacrifices that I probably didn't make sense from a career track perspective, but opened doors that helped me sort of catapult my career. So it was a total positive cycle, and it became, you know, the main thrust of my life.
Melanne, I'm going to go back. You described how you got involved in women's issues in referring to the beginning of Vital Voices, which I'm not sure we mentioned the year. That was, I think, 2001, after you'd been in the White House as Chief of Staff to the First Lady. And I am curious as to how you got involved at the very beginning, but when you were appointed as ambassador, the first ambassador at large for global women's issues, who wrote your job description? How did you know where to start?
Well, that's a very interesting question because one might think, well, if you're going to work on women's issues in the State Department, you probably start a bunch of programs. And that wasn't the intent at all. Both the President and the Secretary made it very clear to me that my job was to integrate women's issues throughout everything the State Department was doing, whether that was through our embassies around the world, whether it was in the Economics Bureau or in conflict and stabilization or in human rights or in all the regional bureaus. Women's perspectives and women's participation would enhance the effectiveness of our work. And it was also a recognition that where women were denied their rights and oppressed, those situations created instability and potential conflict and made us as a country less secure. And where women were empowered, it was just the opposite. And that also entered into the President's strategic report on security. So it was really, my charge was to integrate. And, you know, to integrate sounds, I don't know, sounds amorphous perhaps, or it sounds challenging. And how do you really begin to win over your colleagues so what you're doing is not just a nuisance, not just something they're going to do temporarily, but something they truly own. And the best way to do it, and certainly was correlated in everything that what I undertook, was to make the case that this was in our self-interest. I believe we're all motivated from our self-interest. And to be able to say, whether you were sitting in the Netherlands, where Faye did extraordinary work, for example, on Afghan women, because that country was very much engaged as we were, or one was sitting in Washington or anywhere else, that if we factored this in, we would be far more effective than what we were doing previously or not paying any attention at all. And the real intellectual argument was the moral argument, of course, but it was really the smart strategic argument. It was the data. It was the research. And I'll give you a quick example. I was asked by my colleagues who were working on the Asia Pacific Economic Corporation, APEC for short. This is 21 economies, including the United States, China, and many, many other countries that are bordered by the Pacific. And they said, well, you're going to send some women to this conference. And I said, well, you know, tell me why. Why is it worth this investment? And I did, and it was early on, and when my colleague came back, she said, not again. It was worthless, because the women's portion had no relationship to what APEC was doing. It was a nice thing that was done on the side, something we're accustomed to frequently on what we call women's issues, which are really issues for everybody. So then I saw the statistic that said that at least $90 billion is lost annually in GDP in the region because the potential of women is not tapped. And when I asked how we get women on the agenda of APEC, my colleagues said, well, Tokyo's now got the baton. You can go to Japan, and we're going to have a meeting of the ambassadors of the 21 economies. You can make the pitch. And I write about this in the book. And when I did, the first ambassador came up to me when I concluded my remarks, and he said, that was very interesting. You talked about growth, economic growth. And I think he was worried that what I was going to issue was the Feminist Manifesto, which they could just ignore and would have no relevance. And that really began to create both a huge presence in Japan at the time. Then when it came to the United States, this became a major part of APEC. It continues today. The meeting's just concluded in the Philippines. And what we have behind it is the fact, and the commitment, is to grow women entrepreneurs, to help close the gap on markets and capital, training, and mentors, and that every country has this in their interest if they're going to create jobs and if they're going to grow their economies. So that's called integration, really seeing something we were active on and trying to influence that process.
I want to talk about the book, but before we do, I'd like you to maybe explain how you came upon the name Seneca Women for your...
So we got that right. But Melanne and I both feel, and I think she mentioned it earlier, that we're at a very unique moment because of three key trends. One is this data that she talked about. We have this data. We can make the case. The second is we have historical levels of women in leadership positions. And I always say that, make the joke that yes, we're at 16%. Yes, there's a glass ceiling or a thick layer of men, depending on how you want to look at it. But we are stuck at 16%, it's true, but we're just below everywhere else. And so women are making the day-to-day trade-offs in decision making. And then the third trend, which is very unique to this moment, is the technology and the fact that we can connect. So that was the Seneca Women. The second reason why we wanted to talk about Seneca Falls is because there were 100 men who signed the Declaration of Sentiments in Seneca Falls, one of them being the great abolitionist, and you know, Frederick Douglass, and we really believe that this isn't a women's issue, this is a human issue, and they knew it back in 1848 as well. So even though, you know, we call it Seneca Women, we call it Seneca Women, and Seneca for us stands for something broader than women, and I think that's a really important point. I think Melanne actually speaks about it quite often. The role of men in all this is super important, and that's why we speak about Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Modi and Muhtar Kent and all these male champions, many of whom are in this room. So we want this not to be, again, a women's issue, but a human issue.
And just to be clear, the Seneca Convention was in 1848. So that was something I learned in the book.
We're still on that journey, though.
We're still on that journey. Let's talk about the book a little bit. One of the points that was made before we get into all of the economic development and other things that you speak of, you talk about, or you refer to a philosopher who described the pleasant life, the good life, and the meaningful life. Can you explain this quote and how it influenced you?
Well, that one really could, as one looks at one's life, have a life where all of your needs are met. That's certainly one criteria. Or the middle rung, which is to have the use of your talents represented in the work that you do and being fulfilled by that, and that's a good thing. But the real essence in many ways and the greatest satisfaction in life is to experience meaning, to get out of yourself and make a difference for others, to pay it forward. And there are many different social scientists of one stripe or another whom we refer to from time to time in the book who really go to this. And I think, I certainly feel it, I would imagine many of you do, that in many ways there is a search for purpose in our society today, that we feel something is tangibly lacking as we're all just at each other. And this understanding that when we can give back, however we give back, however we pay it forward, and what is most often said, if I'm a mentor, my mentees likely have grown and learned something and are very grateful. But the reality is most mentors will say, I got far more out of it than anything I gave that mentee. So it's the essence of the greatest part of living, I guess.
I just want to echo what she's saying, because I do think that is the part of the book for me that has been the most rewarding. I mean, we knew the data and we knew how to make the case for women. But I think this idea, what was so fascinating is that the data is also in on purpose. If you look at all those different social scientists that we mentioned in the book, it's from Harvard to Stanford to Penn. You're talking about Martin Seligman, who has a really interesting quote. But all those scientists basically say that there's really a formula for happiness. And it's pretty formulaic. And if you have meaning and purpose in your life, happiness is sort of associated with being a taker, need satisfaction. You're hungry, you eat, you're happy. You want to buy a pair of shoes, you buy them, you're happy. That lasts about 3 days, right? But meaning, however, ties the past, present, and future together through something bigger. And there's a great quote by that same Dr. Elahi who talks about the fact that if you have this larger arc of purpose in your life, and for him it was also, I think, through his work with Cambodia and other work around the world, but if you have this larger arc of purpose, then the day-to-day ups and downs of your life, he says, become dusty storms on the road of your larger journey. And I think there's something very beautiful in that. And Julie and I were just talking earlier about her trip to Bangladesh and how it changed her perspective. When, as Melanne says, when you go and see other, and when you get out of yourself and try to use what you have for something bigger than yourself, you help other people, but in the same time, you're shifting your own perspective. And that's, I think, one of the most valuable things that you can do for yourself. Of course, helping others is important to help others. I mean, that's what we want to do. We want to fast forward the world. But also to help yourself, it happens at the same time.
The United States is considered a leader in many areas, and I think the question would be, how do you feel we're doing here in the United States on women's issues?
We could do better. Clearly, we have led the way in many ways, but I think it is particularly apparent when it comes to the fact that we've got so many women in the workplace today, and that is growing. And if you just look at the numbers of women with a child under 1, the majority of those are in the workplace. And what we're struggling with is, and there's no good word, juggle, balance, whatever it is, to unite in some ways our lives so we can be good parents and good employees. We are the only industrial country in the world with no paid family leave. We've got to do better. Everybody is struggling with how to ensure that they can afford child care and care for their children through that child care in a way that they know the child is safe and will have an enhanced environment. That is very difficult to achieve. If you're doing exceptionally well, you can do much better, but the people who most need the help are obviously ones on very low incomes. And then we've got the whole issue of equal pay for equal work. To lose 21 cents on every dollar from your income may for some not be a big deal. But think of that single parent who is not earning a whole lot, what losing that 21 cents represents each and every time. These are very big issues. When I was in the White House, we had the first ever conference, U.S. conference on childcare. And I remember at the time, Bob Rubin from Goldman Sachs was the Secretary of Treasury, and Hillary Clinton said, we need Bob to open this childcare conference. And when I went to him, he said, what do I know about childcare? But the reality was it sent a very strong message because it is critical to our economy and the quality of productive employees. It is a critical way that we show our care for families in our
The fourth conference, World Conference on Women, 1995, and you worked with a woman named Ann Dunham, whose name did not immediately ring a bell. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, this is really a very interesting piece, and then Kim might want to come in on the Avon piece, because in many ways what they were doing through a company structure with small amounts of credit through product to really begin to grow a middle class. But in this case, 20 years ago, microcredit was not anything most people knew. It wasn't even among negatives to our male friends. The women would take the small amounts of credit, get that milk cow. 20 years ago, the fourth UN World Conference on Women, was that at the same time that she was going, at the President's request, at the Secretary General's request to deliver a keynote speech, a woman by the name of Ann Dunham was working very, very hard behind the scenes to get her, while in Beijing, to participate in a panel discussion on microcredit. And there were issues, there were invitations that were issued, and in trying to get Hillary to be on this panel, we certainly didn't know, was a woman who was very active in the area of women world banking and trying to help the poor through credit. Ann Dunham was the mother of Barack Obama. And the same Barack Obama would then ask Hillary Clinton to be his Secretary of State, and she would continue to work on microcredit. So it is in many ways a virtuous cycle. The sadness is that Ann died before the Beijing conference. She had gotten cancer, and we never knew until after it happened just how instrumental she was in bringing all of these forces together.
Kim, you want to talk a little bit about credit and the work of Avon?
Sure. I mean, obviously, microcredit since then has become something that's very well known around the world. Professor Yunus received the Nobel Peace Prize. But we at Avon back then used to say that Avon was the oldest microcredit institution in the world because we would advance product to the sellers before they would actually give money. So that was a way of extending credit. But credit, obviously, is really critical to women's economic empowerment. And it's really been a big inhibitor. We talk about the 3 inhibitors to access to capital, to women's entrepreneurship, and one of them is access to capital. Andrea Jung, the former CEO of Avon, in another stroke of fate, we were writing the book, and we had written the whole chapter on microcredit, on the relationship between microcredit and Eunice, and how it was parallel to Avon, and how this whole thing. And then we were with Andrea, and she said, oh, by the way, I'm going to partner with Mohammed Yunus. I'm going to run Grameen America. And I said, we wrote the book already. How could it be? We wrote the whole chapter about you and Yunus. And so the final piece of that chapter is that Andrea Jung and Mohammed Yunus have teamed up to prove that microcredit works in this country, which is a really important concept. But I also just wanted to talk just for a moment about a little bit more about shared value, because when we think about partnering with women and the fact that they repay their loans and all the things that Melanne has talked about, Professor Michael Porter has sort of coined the term shared value in the past couple of years from Harvard, and basically he talks about the fact that companies can do well and do good. That's sort of that was the Avon parlance, do well and do good. But Professor Porter talks about shared value, and we believe that the best partners in shared value are women. And so, and I see Elaine sitting here, and I keep thinking about Abbott as I'm sitting here because I think about the program that they're doing with women farmers, for example. It's a way to sort of source from women farmers, which empowers the women farmers, gives them a market, and at the same time, does well for the company. And so I think back to this whole idea of what we want out of this book from a multi-generational perspective is for each person to think about how they can partner with women effectively. And I think our corporate leaders are starting to recognize that. And I think Mohammed Yunus and Andrea get it, why if you want to have economic growth in this country, you're going to have to empower the bottom of the pyramid in this country. And it's going to be through women. And I was actually on the phone with her this morning, and she was telling me this huge amount of loans that they're deploying for women entrepreneurs in this country. It's unbelievable, and the repayment rates are amazing. And so it still holds true today as it did 20 years ago at Beijing.
One last question before we turn it over to the audience, which is at the end of the book you have a toolkit. And maybe you can explain why you included that.
Well, you know, we're both asked, is what can I do? That's always the question, what can I do? There's such a sense among people everywhere, and particularly women with whom we have so many dealings, who are eager to make a difference. And in writing the book, which is all about finding one's own purpose through understanding where we each sit, what power do we command? Whether we're running a company, whether we're an ambassador, whether we are in middle management where so much happens, whether we are at the grassroots level, we each have something that we can do to really have meaning, and the ripple effect can have tremendous outcomes. And in doing that, we understood that it would be very helpful to have sort of both a practical guide, a how-to, if you will. And so the back of the book has this toolkit in 3 categories. How do you understand what your power is, what you can go through, what some of the difficulties are, et cetera? How do you find your purpose, and how do you execute your purpose? Where can you begin to have some impact? And then how do you connect with others, and what are those opportunities? So it's meant to be a how-to, because our goal, I mean, we're grateful that we got the book finally written, but it would be a failing if at the conclusion of this effort, we didn't really come together to activate greater efforts here, everywhere, to advance women and girls. And that's our real goal. And that's why we've created Seneca Women, which is sort of a community online and beyond, to really move an effort that will help us come together in ways that we can take advantage of this historic moment, seize the opportunity, and truly make a difference.
Thank you. Thank you both. And I think now we're going to turn it over to me. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'd like to go out to the audience for questions. If you wouldn't mind, please, raising your arm and waiting for a mic and making sure it's a question. Who'd like to kick it off? Okay, I'll kick it off then. So you mentioned twice Abe and Modi and Mukhtar Kent. Could you talk to us a little bit about some American men in leadership positions, CEOs or anybody else that you think is kind of leading the way in this regard, other than just globally?
Yeah, sure. This is like my favorite topic, because coming from the corporate world, I love to go into all environments, and I usually have a slide behind me with all these companies. And what's amazing about it is it's not women's companies, just women's companies. I didn't say just, and I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean, we had Avon, and we have Mary Kay, and we have all these incredible companies that focus on women, and it makes sense for them to think about women's empowerment. But today you have companies ranging from banks, from Bank of America and Goldman and JP Morgan to huge, obviously all the consumer products companies. Pharma, we're so happy that Abbott and others are leading the way on the pharma front. But all of these, frankly, all the companies I'm mentioning are run by men. So every single one of those companies has a male CEO who's championing these issues. And my favorite quote is Bob Zoellick, former Goldman Sachs at the World Bank, who says gender equality is smart economics. I mean, I think it says it all when the World Bank comes out and says that. So that's a very exciting moment that we're in. And we think that sort of ties to the toolkit, which is that though we have these incredible male champions, and we have women leaders as well, not as many at the CEO level, but it's for each of us to understand what we can do. Because if we do that, we have this chance to fast forward. And so we're very optimistic, because we travel a lot now, obviously talking about the book, and people are saying, well, we haven't cracked that glass ceiling, it's demoralizing. But the fact is we're so close. And if we lose this moment, I fear that we won't get it back again. So our sort of call to action and our plea, frankly, is that each person in this room think about their own power and how they can deploy it for something bigger.
Great.
And what's interesting about the companies is their decision is a business decision. Yeah. Kate Spade, for example, makes handbags and other accessories. They have a factory they are creating in Rwanda, and you think, well, that's got to be a philanthropic undertaking. It's a business undertaking that is going to create a place where ultimately the Rwandan women will own it as a co-op, but it will be a place where you can get these beautiful products made. And if you're a Kate Spade or you're another company that wants to come in, you can avail yourself of it. But think what it does for the local women. So a business investment is having this enormous spin-off to raise up the economic viability of women. And the other thing that is happening is it's women, mainly at middle management levels, who are having these tremendous impacts within their companies to push this agenda forward.
Can I just mention one other company, because this always strikes me. You know, Walmart, obviously one of the hugest companies in the world, has this incredible program, which is a three-pronged program, but one of the prongs that really is amazing to me is the sourcing from women entrepreneurs. They've committed to source $20 billion from women entrepreneurs by 2017. You think about $20 billion in the hands of women entrepreneurs in this country, the ripple effect of that is unbelievable, and that's just the US number. They're committed to doubling in every other country around the world. So this concept that companies can be a force for good, or at least align their goals with the goals of women. I mean, we want more and more people to think about how their resources can be redirected in this way, because we're not really asking for any sort of favors, quote unquote. This is a business decision, as Melanne's saying, and so it's a question of how do you think about your resources and your business decisions in a different way. And many of the male leaders are so articulate on this concept, which is, this is just smart business.
But
And
doesn't,
just- sorry, Faye.
doesn't Walmart also identify those products as women
Women-owned,
sourced,
yes.
women-owned?
Yeah, that's
And
really
they use
exciting.
it for promotion of the materials and their own brand,
Yes.
right?
And just quickly to follow up on a point from earlier, since we're on American companies, you mentioned that the US is the only country in the OECD that doesn't have paid parental leave. Are those male CEOs who are taking this as a business decision, are they helping to move the needle in that regard?
Well, in fact, that is one of the things that's happening is we talk about a law firm, for example, Orrick, which is one in its own class that has now put in place 22 weeks of paid parental leave on their own, not waiting for action from public policy and from government. But we need actors in all places. But yes, business leaders are doing that more and more on their own.
Can
Yes,
I
Kim.
follow up on
And
that?
some of the tech companies as well.
I think I wanted to make this point earlier, but we moved on. But this concept of childcare and the issue of work, quote unquote, life balance, which I really hate that, pitting work against life. There's got to be a better way to think about this. But this whole idea that we are stuck in this childcare, you know, actually we're the only developed, but I think only Papua New Guinea and us in the whole world don't have paid maternity leave. But I think what's really important about this is that in interviewing all these people, what we're realizing is that as women are ascending to power, they're increasingly using their power for purpose. And in a sense, redefining what success looks like, redefining the way we work and live. And so we're at this point where we could design things differently. And so I always reference this professor I had from Cornell who talked about design flaws. And she said, you know, why would you ever design a workday that's 9 to 7 and a school day that's 9 to 3? You would just never do it. It's not good for men. It's not just good for women. It's not good for kids. It's a design flaw. Are you okay?
Yeah.
So you would never do that. So the idea that as women are in sort of rising in the levels of power, I think we are going to think about work differently. And by the way, millennials are demanding it. It's not just women who want purpose in their work, who want a different kind of work-life balance. Anybody who works with the next generation knows that millennials demand purpose. 60% say they won't even work at a company unless they understand the purpose, that there's a greater purpose. So I think women are sort of an entry point for having this conversation, but it's a conversation that if we change the way we design things, everybody will be better off for it. So it's not a women's issue, it's really a human issue, and I think women are in positions of power becoming the entry point for that conversation.
Great, thanks. Okay, now loads of questions. All right, there in the middle, please, with the green jacket. Thank you.
Is there any country that you've seen that you would describe as having total gender equality?
There is
and
no-
if so, did it just happen or was it manufactured? How did it happen?
There is no country in which there is total gender equality. The countries that are doing best, if we take one survey, for example, the World Economic Forum, which is, you know, the sort of barons of industry and the economy, they put out an annual gender gap report. Now, nobody would accuse the WEF of being a women's organization. Why do they put out a gender gap report? Because what they've done is they've looked at all of the countries who have data and that's a great, great number. And they've looked at accessibility on healthcare, education, economic participation, political participation. In those countries where the gap between men and women is closer to being closed, to answer your question, in no place is it closed, where it's closer to being closed, those countries are far more economically competitive and prosperous. Obviously, they are unleashing the talent of half of their populations and making it easier for them to contribute. Now, how have they gotten there? The countries at the top always are the Scandinavian countries. And they have incredible policies that really fast forward, if you will, the closing the gender gap in all of those areas. So a lot of it is governmental, but obviously also in step with other actors in civil society and with the corporate sector. So it didn't happen magically. It happened purposefully. It's the way they make their investments. You know, I have a friend from Norway who's in the government, and he says, you know, we're often accused of just using our oil, that we do so well in this category because we have oil revenues. He said, no, the reason is the way we use our resources to plow a commitment into these areas. So you have to make it a priority, and then you have to amass all the key players in society to move in that direction.
Great, next question. Yes, the woman right there, please, with the glasses.
Hi. As a former Peace Corps volunteer, I served in Guinea in West Africa, a very underdeveloped country, about 10 years ago. And while I was there, as an American, of course, you wonder, why is this country like this? And I came to the realization that it's because they hadn't undergone a women's revolution. Now, of course, there are other factors as well, but I do feel, and hearing you today, I feel justified in making that assumption. They seem very far off from having a women's revolution due to cultural barriers, limitations in education, etc. Though I do feel something that could make a difference would be their access to social media. That seems to be something like across the board that men and women have access to there. So I'm wondering, and I know you touched on technology very briefly, I'm wondering if you do see that as the potential way for some of these countries to become connected to the rest of the world and, in a sense, maybe have a revolution of their own.
You know, that's a great question, and I think from my point of view, your observation is exactly right, because if you look at where countries are in the human development spectrum, those countries that are far worse on equal opportunity for women are always at the bottom. They're just not making it economically, they're not making it by any other measure because they're keeping half of their potential down, if you will. This question about technology is very interesting, and it is so critical to closing the gender gap. There is a gap in mobile technology and in the internet. And if we don't really work in this country to bring more girls into the STEM sciences, if we don't work to make tech opportunities in the tech field more easily accessible, we're going to be on the short end increasingly. And we have a lot in the book about the United States. But in terms of the rest of the world, mobile technology is one of the greatest tools of development. We know, for example, that when a woman has a simple cell phone, not even a fancy iPhone, a simple cell phone, she can protect herself from violence, which is happening in the DRC. She can get vital health information even if she's illiterate. It can be used as a tool for education. And most importantly, and most excitedly, it is becoming the way that the poorest people can be banked so they can make financial transactions safely, simply through their cell phone. Now, there is this huge gender gap, and where women have access, they will tell you. For example, I listened to a woman farmer from India, and she said, I used to walk a long, long way to find my market on a given day, only to find no market. If I had been able to use that phone, I would save time. In fact, once I got my phone, I now have 2 tiny enterprises because I've been freed up. So it's a great question, and I think the more accessibility, and there are companies that we point out in the book, like Intel, for example, like Vodafone, who are doing very exciting work in making this mobile technology more accessible, particularly to poor women.
I just want to add to that one point on media, because I think about culture and I think about media, and I think Melanne is so right on, as usual, by the way, about all things that the role that technology can do to unleash the power of women. I think you're also focusing, though, on the cultural barriers that exist, which are sometimes very hard to change. And so while we have more connectivity, we still have entrenched ideology around women that we have to deal with. And in some parts of the world, it's obviously a lot worse than others, and I think there's nobody better to speak about that than Melanne, frankly. But there's 2 points that I wanted to make. One is on media, and I think Gina Davis's work is really important, and I mention it everywhere I go now, because I feel that her work on understanding the way women are depicted in the media is not just important for this country, although it is. And she tells us, for example, that 17% of people in crowd scenes are women, when women are 50% of the population. So you might see a correlation between our 17% at leadership gap and 17% of women in crowd scenes. Maybe we see women at 17% as normal, for example. Or as girls watch more TV, they lose confidence. As boys watch more TV, they gain confidence. But what was really interesting in the interview with Gina was that she said when she was in DC, I think she might have even been with Melanne, she was talking to a big group of people about this, and they came up to her from the Congo, and they said, "You have to help us in the Congo." And she said, "You know, I'm an actress. I think you want to speak to Ambassador Verveer." And they said, "Oh no, you have to tell them to stop exporting Desperate Housewives." This really happened, because we're exporting 80% of the media around the world, and so the way we depict women gets exported everywhere, and so that's one point that I want to make. The other quick point is that cultural change is a very deep, entrenched thing, and Melanne can give you great examples from Tolston to all these great organizations who are working on changing cultural practices. And there's one there's 2 in the book that are really important to me. One is Kekenya, this woman named Kekenya, who really helped transform a culture around FGM. And she was a young child herself. She had undergone FGM, but she made a deal with her parents and then her elders that she would undergo FGM if they let her get an education. And she took that education, she got a PhD, and she went back and started a girls' school. And little by little, she's changing the mindsets of the men and the women, too, in her village. The other one is a woman in Iran, in the 20th century, rural Iran, who was blind, frail, and lived in rural Iran, and was yet able to have an impact on the men and women in her village about the way they viewed the value and rights of women and girls. And what strikes me about her is that hers was about not being the loudest or being the most powerful. She was blind and frail, but she had a power of perspective, and she brought people along to change their mentalities. And they started respecting her so much. And she has this great quote which says, "If you change a person's mind, their actions will follow." So sometimes we're very focused on the actions, but we really need to focus on the mindsets.
Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today, but
dear.
please join me in thanking all of our panelists, and Faye, Kim, and Melanne.
Thank you. That was great, Faith. Thank you.
They'll be outside signing the book, so fast forward out to get your book.